Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to set up a Wireguard VPN server and connect 2 remote clients to your local network. This tutorial is going to show you how to do the following. Install Docker on a Linux virtual machine. Install Portainer to manage your Docker containers in a UI format. Install Wireguard VPN server as a Docker container. Forward your ports on your router. Install Wireguard as a client on a remote computer and connect to your VPN server. And finally, install Wireguard as a client on a cell phone and connect to your VPN server. This is a fun and easy method of getting exposure to VPNs and a great service to run in your home lab. My current use cases for running Wireguard VPN are to access my Plex Media server and stream Steam games to my mobile devices so I can watch movies and play Steam games while I'm traveling, as well as being able to manage my home lab remotely. A VPN into your home network is great for accessing network devices without having to expose anything publicly other than your Wireguard server. And just a heads up, I did have to blur out a lot of details in this video to protect my IP address and other identifying information, but you should still be able to get the point across. Okay, so that's enough of the intro. Let's get this tutorial started. Alright, so here we are on my Ubuntu virtual machine that I'm just running off of my Windows 10 desktop. If you guys don't know how to create a virtual machine on Windows 10, it's pretty easy. I'm not going to go into too much detail onto how to explain it here, but Hyper-V is just a virtualization built into Windows that you can access from typing in Hyper-V Manager in your Start menu. Once Hyper-V pulls up, you'll get a screen similar to this, and to create an Ubuntu machine pretty easily, Hyper-V gives you this quick create option that you can kind of step through. You could select your operating system of choice. I just chose Ubuntu 22.04 as that's the latest long-term stable release, and you just hit create and it'll download the Ubuntu image and spin up a new Ubuntu virtual machine for you. So I'm already connected, and inside of that VM, this virtual machine is going to act as our WireGuard server. It is going to be what we connect to from the outside world to get into our home network. So this is a brand new virtual machine, so with every new Linux machine, you'll want to update everything. So to do that, I'm just going to run a sudo apt update command, and then a sudo apt upgrade, and it's already up to date, so that's pretty easy. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to get Docker installed on this virtual machine, so that way we can run Portainer as a Docker manager, a Docker UI manager of sorts. I'll show you that, and then we're going to install WireGuard through Docker as well. The nice thing about installing WireGuard through Docker is you can take these Docker commands that I'm going to show you and drop them onto any machine of any operating system that has Docker installed, and you can run WireGuard as a Docker container off of any machine. It doesn't have to be Linux. You can install Docker on Windows and run this Docker command directly on your Windows machine, and you'll have a WireGuard container set up for you. So to start off, I'm going to go ahead and copy my commands to get Docker installed. And all these commands I will have included either in the description of the video or in a paste bin link that you can use to just rip and copy. So this is just a sudo apt-get install of some Docker dependencies first. And then I'm going to create a keyrings directory for Docker to use. Going to run a curl command to download the Docker GPG keys and store them in that keyrings directory that we just made. Now we're going to update the Ubuntu repositories on this local machine to have the Docker repositories. We're going to run an update command to update our repositories to pull down the new Docker repository information. And then with that, we can run a simple sudo apt install command to install all of our Docker dependencies. So here we're telling Ubuntu to install Docker CE, Docker CE CLI, Container DIO, and the Docker Compose plugin. All this information is easily obtainable. These commands I'm running, I'm just following a guide from the Docker website. They lay it out pretty easily for you to follow. While Docker is installing, I'll just pull that up in a quick Google for you. So you can just type in how to install Docker on Ubuntu. And the Docker documentation is literally the first link. Supports the 2204 OS that we're using. And you could just come down here and you can see that these commands are pretty much the same commands that I ran in front of you in the terminal. And this doc will get you set up with running Docker on Ubuntu. Alright, so now that we have Docker installed, the next thing we'll want to do is install Portainer, so that way we can use it as a kind of Docker management UI tool. Portainer runs as a Docker container in and of itself. It allows you a nice UI to build, set up, monitor your Docker containers. So the first thing we need to do is create a volume for Portainer to use for its storage to keep its data. So that's a simple Docker volume create Portainer command. We'll need to run that as sudo. And then we'll simply run the Docker command to pull down, build, and set up the Portainer image. So here, I gotta drill back to the beginning to drop the sudo to it. But we're telling Docker to run in detached mode. That's what this -d is. -p is the ports we want to publish. So we want to publish the Docker Docker Portainer UI to port 9000. So this is just saying we're mapping the internal 9000 port to the external 9000 port. We're giving it the name of Portainer. We're telling it to always restart. And then these -v's are mapping the volumes to the Docker container, telling it which volumes to use. So you can see here's the Portainer data volume that we created in the above command, and that is just being mapped to a /data volume on the Docker container itself. And then we're pulling down the Portainer image, and this is just the latest tag from that Portainer, so we'll get the latest version installed. Okay, it is now running, and we can confirm that with a Docker ps command. List out the containers running, and we'd see our Portainer container is running. So if we wanted to, now we can come into an internet browser and we could go to the UI over port 9000. And you can see we get the Portainer IO UI, and it's asking us to set up a password. So I'll set up a basic password here for the admin account. And we'll create that user. Go ahead and get started. And here is where we are inside the Portainer web dashboard. And if we hit containers here, we can see that we have our Portainer container running. So to make sure that Portainer starts up every time on system startup, whenever this virtual machine starts up, I like to just add a command. We'll switch into the root user here, and we'll pop into the cron tab screen. And this is the first time we're using it, so I'm going to say I want to use Nano as my text editor to set up the cron tab. So cron tabs are just a way to set up a scheduled task in Linux machines if you're not familiar with it. There's a whole cron tab syntax for timing that you'll want to use. But for here, just to make sure that Portainer starts on startup, I'm going to create this cron job essentially by putting in this command. So basically, as the root user, every time this system starts up or reboots, it's going to kick off this docker run command, which should make sure that Portainer starts any given time that this machine is up itself. So here, just to kind of give a visual representation of the commands I'm running in terminal versus what is happening in Portainer on the UI. We're now at the part where we want to install the WireGuard server onto our virtual machine to act as our WireGuard VPN server. So any external connections that we want to connect to our home network will essentially be routed to this virtual machine. And I guess the one thing I want to double check here is that this has a public IP address and that I configured this virtual machine correctly, which I did not. So this is pulling a right here 172.27.252 address. That's a Docker internal address. So basically this isn't grabbing an IP address from my internal LAN network, which we're going to need to if we want to actually tell outside connections which virtual machine to route WireGuard traffic to. So to fix that real quick, I can just minimize this virtual machine and come into Hyper-V, and we'll have to do a little configuration changes here. The issue is this default switch and network adapter. It's not picking up any external connections, so I'm going to assign it an external virtual switch real quick, which you can create in the virtual switch manager. I just happen to have it created already. Essentially, you would create a new virtual network switch for an external type, name it, tie it to your computer's NIC, and that will allow it to grab an actual IP address dished out by your router or DHCP server, and this will allow us to be able to connect to the virtual machine from outside of your local LAN network. So now that that's added, and just to confirm that, I'm going to do another IPA, and we can see that our new IP address is assigned to 192.168.0.126, and that is going to be the IP address that we're going to eventually port forward to send our external traffic through to WireGuard. Back to installing WireGuard as a Docker container. First, we need to create a new volume for WireGuard to use, similar to how we did the Portainer volume earlier. So we're going to type sudo, paste in our Docker volume create command, and we're just going to create a volume called WireGuard data. And that created. So then the next thing we're going to do is actually create the WireGuard container with the following Docker command. And the great thing about Portainer is that you could set up all these parameters within the UI over here, but for this tutorial, I think it's going to be easier to just copy and paste this Docker create command into your terminal and then edit things in the UI later as needed. So just to break down what this Docker create is doing, we're going to create a new Docker image called WireGuard. We're going to give it some capabilities here of netadmin and sysmodule. These are just permissions it needs to properly do its job. The PUID and the PGID are just values provided from the WireGuard Docker documentation. And again, for that, I can show you the open source or the web documentation for this, which you can just Google WireGuard Linux server Docker. And it's this Docker Hub website here. The commands that I'm ripping here on the left in the terminal are literally just ripped from down here with a few unneeded and optional fields removed. So over here, back to this. For this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to connect from a external server, like a server from New York. I'm in the Midwest, so I'm going to be connecting from a server on the East Coast to my home network in the Midwest. And then I'm also going to show you how to set it up on your phone with the Wireguard application. So I'm going to set up 2 peers that we're going to use for authentication. One peer is going to be the East Coast computer, and the other peer is going to be the cell phone to connect to Wireguard. For peer DNS, you can just copy this as 10.13.13.1 because that's going to be the host of the Wireguard server. TZ America Chicago because I'm in the Midwest. Your port's going to be the default 51820 port over UDP. You can change this port if you want. This is the default Wireguard port, so you're welcome to change this if to another port for security reasons, whatever your personal preference is. You'll just have to remember to port forward to the correct port when we're done here. Then we're just mapping volumes to the Docker container, giving it right IPv4 permissions. I'm not totally sure what this command does, but it's important. The restart policy is restart it unless manually stopped. And then the Linux server Wireguard, which I think we can just add the latest tag here and it'll pull the latest. It probably would have pulled the latest anyway without that tag, but just to be safe, I'm going to go ahead and do that. So you can see here we're pulling down the Wireguard image now, and we should see the container start to spin up here on our containers list in Portainer once everything is downloaded and gets set up. And here's the Wireguard container created. So now to kick this off, we should just have to right click it within Portainer and click start. And we could see that we have ports, or the port 51820 being published out from the Docker container. Now we need to go get the private keys and public keys to connect to and authenticate to our Wireguard server. And to do that, you can just hit this little exec console option for the Wireguard container inside of Portainer. And now we have a terminal into the Wireguard container itself. So we just need to pull out some information for the peers. The peer information is stored in, I believe, config. Yeah, so here we have the peer 1 information and the peer 2 information. So before we start setting up our devices to connect, the next step is going to be port forwarding from our router. So here we are on my router's port forwarding section. It's going to vary router for router where this port forwarding configuration option is in your router, how it looks in your router. The best way to log into your router is it's either going to be 192.168.0.1 or 1.1. Honestly, the best way to get your router information is to pull up a command prompt if you're on Windows and do an ipconfig command. And this will show you what your default gateway is right here. And your default gateway is going to be your router information, your router IP. So you'll type that into a web browser to get logged in to your router. And here you can see I have a service already set up for Wireguard VPN. External and internal ports are the 51820 port, but the internal IP address is pointing to something different. Remember, the VM that we are using in this tutorial is an IP of .126. So I'm just going to edit this and change this IP address to 126. And it's that easy to port forward. You might have to look up a tutorial for your own router, that might be the easiest part for you. Obviously, if you're not using a Netgear Nighthawk R7000, this screen may look different for you. But this is telling the router to say, hey, anytime external traffic hits the router from port 51820, go ahead and route that traffic to the internal IP address of 192.168.0.126, which is our WireGuard server, and it should be set up listening for connections anyway. So now that we're back into our virtual machine, we've got our port forwarding setup, and we've got WireGuard installed as a server on this Ubuntu VM. All we need to do now is configure and set up our machines. So Pier 1 I'm going to use as the East Coast computer. So I will go ahead and cd into Pier 1. And the information we want out of here is pretty much just the pier1.conf information, which we can cat out here. Let me clean up my terminal because I don't know how to type. So obviously this is my public IP address, which I'm going to have to blur out for you guys for security reasons. But we can essentially just copy this entire config. So I'm going to pop over to my East Coast computer now and get WireGuard installed from scratch, show you how easy it is to install WireGuard as a client and connect up. Alright, so here we are. I'm consoled in directly into my East Coast server. And just to kind of prove to you that this is a server that is on the East Coast that is going to be connecting to my home computer in the Midwest, I'm going to hit a quick API. So here you can see it's listing my IP address with the network. You can see that this server is located in Malden, Massachusetts, a good long ways away from where I am physically located in the Midwest. So here we are on the server. We just rebooted it after updating it. So now we want to actually install WireGuard. Alright, so this is where we're going to bounce back and forth a little bit. So inside the VM here, we have our configuration for our peer. This is the information we're going to copy over to our East Coast computer that we want to run as a client. So it's as simple as catting out the peer 1 conf config file. We could copy it, and let's see if we can copy it into our SSH here. And we need to go into etc WireGuard. This is an empty directory, so we need to create the wgo.conf file. Easy as that, and then we'll just vi into it from here. And it should be as easy as, yep, just right clicking and pasting in the new config information. This should be all we need to connect up. So I will right quit out of that. The port should be forwarded, so we'll check this out. I'm actually going to switch back to the console because as soon as I enable WireGuard, it's going to disconnect me. Alright, so here we are logged back into the direct console session on the East Coast computer. So I'm just going to see if I can cat out that WireGuard WG conf that we made, and it copied and saved successfully. So we will go ahead, and the CLI syntax for starting and stopping WireGuard on a client machine is wg-quick up wg0. So we're saying we want the wg0 interface to be up. It's runs a bunch of stuff, blah 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 blah. It looks good, no errors. One way that we can confirm this actually works is if we go back into the VM, into our WireGuard machine here, and we can type wg show. And right here we can see our peer 1, our endpoint that it's connected from, the IP address of the server, the latest handshake, and the transfer being sent. So if you see this after running WG show on your WireGuard server, you've got a successful handshake, your VPN should be working. To confirm, I'm going to go into my East Coast machine again and see if I could just ping a local IP address of mine, which will be 192.168.0.4. And there we go. This is an East Coast computer, probably at least 1,000 miles away from where I'm physically located. It is connected to my home network and it can communicate to my home servers. This is just an example of, like, if you have a laptop and you're traveling, you could still connect to your home network remotely from anywhere in the world, so long as your virtual machine is up and running on the PC of your choice. So that way this Docker container is always running. So we've got a successful VPN connection from the East Coast to my physical home network in the Midwest. Next thing I'd like to show you is how to install WireGuard on an Android phone, because it is so extremely easy. So here we are on the WireGuard host virtual machine, and we want to set up a second client, and the second client is going to be our mobile phone. And the great thing about WireGuard is you can export the configuration into a QR code, and then the WireGuard application allows you to just scan the QR code and import the config. To do that, we want to generate the QR code for the WireGuard configuration. Since we're going to be using the Peer 2 information for our phone, since it's going to be our second device that we're connecting to this VPN, we're going to CD into the Peer 2 folder. So we can cat out the Peer 2 configuration. Can go ahead and copy this, and we can open up a new tab in our favorite web browser and simply Google search for a QR code generator. And this is our guy right here. This very first one should do the trick. We just paste our config in there and we get this nice QR code, which we're going to turn around and scan on our mobile device to import the VPN configuration. So here, I'm just going to search for the WireGuard application on my App Store. I've already got it installed, so I'm going to disable Wi-Fi and go ahead and open up the application. I can hit the blue plus icon to add a new configuration, and I'm just going to scan from QR code. I'm going to scan the QR code that we generated just a moment ago. And I'm going to give it a name of Home Test 1, and this is going to import the configuration from our wg0.conf file on our client. I'm going to go ahead and enable this VPN connection, and you can see at the bottom the transfer is ticking up. So just to make sure that this works, I'm going to connect to my local NAS server. And there we have it. I'm able to connect while connected to data on my cell phone. So here we are in the terminal of our WireGuard Docker container again. And if we do WG show, we can see that both clients we have set up and are connected and able to VPN into our home network and access anything on our home network like we were on our actual home Wi-Fi. So Peer 1 is a computer that I've set up on the East Coast, 1,000 miles away from where I'm physically located, and Peer 2 is my mobile phone, where as long as I have data, I can use the WireGuard app and VPN into my home network from there. So I hope this was a good video to show you how to use WireGuard and how easy it is to use WireGuard. Almost no time. I think overall that took like 30 minutes, if that. And I was able to connect to my home network from anywhere in the world, which is super cool, super useful. You can use it for all sorts of home lab stuff. if you run security cameras, you don't have to expose your security cameras to the outside world. Anytime you want to look at them and review, you could just VPN into your home network and look at them from there like you were actually home. So I hope this was a good educational video. If you guys have any questions, feel free to let me know. Like, comment, subscribe. I appreciate the view, and thank you.